Thank you so much for that introduction. Welcome everybody to, I guess, our first lecture of the day. And I'm gonna probably bore you a little bit, but I'm gonna share my screen and we're gonna talk a little bit today about teaching Korean American immigration, history, and post-LA uprising and political awakening. And I'm just gonna say this is a tall order, right? So I'm probably gonna take a lot of your time today. So I'm going to have a little bit of discussion about the different topics. I may not be able to get into as much detail as I would like to in certain things, but at the end, I'm going to open it up for discussion and I'm going to ask you guys questions. So let's get prepared, maybe take a few notes, and here we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is probably actually share my screen a little bit better. So let me put this into a slideshow mode. Where do I go? What do I do? Slideshow. Well, there, perfect. Okay, from current slide, from beginning. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do here is talk a little bit about the Asian American population and then give you kind of an understanding of where the Korean American population stands today, since we are talking about teaching Korean American history and immigration. And so if you look, Asian American population is growing quickly. It is the fastest growing population in this country today. By 2060, we'll be at 46.2 million, up from 22.4 million, doubling the population in what, 40 years, right? So that's pretty fast. And so if we're looking at that, then let's think about where the Korean American population has come from, right? Where were we, right? Where are we going? So we have been steadily increasing over the years from 2000, from 1.2 million, 2010 to 1.7 million, 2015 to 1.8 million, 2019 to about 1.9 million. And if you kind of count those who are undocumented, et cetera, who didn't fill out the census survey, we're probably more at like 2 million. And this is a great thing to see because while we may be a small slice of the American pie, we are visible. And I'll get into the reasons as to why we are visible now versus why we weren't quite visible during the 1992 LA civil unrest and why we may not have been as visible even prior to that, even though we had the Korean War, which we call the forgotten war, right? So let's think about that for a second. But we'll talk about all these different things. But I just wanted to give you this quick overview of what the Korean American population has looked like from 2000 to present. But remember, our population was about 7,000, right, in the early 1900s. So we have really come a long way. Now, when we're talking about teaching Korean American immigration and history, why is this important? I think it's important that we address this question. Why is it needed? And here's a moment where I'm going to open it up to you guys because I like to have more of a discussion versus me just straight lecturing at you. But I'll tell you really quickly, here are some statistics from the Pew Research Center. About 1/4 of Asian Americans say they're well informed about Asian history in the United States. That's not a lot, right? Don't you think? That's not a lot. So why is it needed? Why is it important? Let me ask you that. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Any comments on that? Why you think it's important to teach Korean American history and just Asian American history, especially as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic here? Mm-hmm. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a thought or a comment. Why it's so important. No? No takers? Oh, yes. Go ahead, Dr. Kim.
So I know, like, as you mentioned, during the COVID pandemic, there were actually two pandemics that were happening. One was COVID-19, and the second was a surge in anti-Asian racism. So out here in Orange County, OC Human Relations reported an 1,800% increase in hate incidents toward Asian Americans. But this wasn't just a surge, really. It was a resurgence, as I'm sure you're going to share about. And it comes from stereotypes like yellow peril, something dangerous about those people from that place, right? Which has been historically a part of our country, or model minority. And that's oftentimes used to create a wedge between different groups, or persistent foreigner. Like if you look a certain way that you're never really an American. So if I would ask a lot of people, could you even name one Korean American that made a difference in the United States? even teachers, educated history teachers, even, I think many would, not in this group, I'm sure there's this group, there's probably many, but if I say, hey, could you name one Korean American that made a difference in the United States? They would struggle. So if they can't name one, then what do people think about when they see someone that looks like an Asian in this country? It's going to revert back to the stereotypes, right? Which is why the resurgence, I think, in anti-Asian hate.
Exactly. Dr. Kim couldn't have said it better, right? Like, that's exactly it. We have so many stereotypes attached to the Asian American community. The model minority myth, right? The yellow peril ideology, which has its historic roots, right? I mean, we're talking about 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act based on yellow peril alone, right? And yellow peril is this ideology that Asians are a threat, right? Economically, right? Sexually, and in other ways. And this is something that is persistent. It continues to this day. And if we are going to combat these stereotypes, we need to know about our history. If we don't know about our history, we're on, to quote Dr. Edward T. Chang, we're on shaky ground. We have nothing to stand on. It's a slippery slope. We can't point back to, look, in history, anti-Asian hate was always there. 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was the first immigration law enacted by this country based on race. First one. Some might argue it was the 1875 Page Act, but really most scholars point to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So we're talking about the importance here of why we need to teach Asian American history and specifically Korean American history. And I'm going to say specifically Korean American history in this case, because this is, of course, the title of the seminar, but also because the Korean American community, being such a small slice of the pie, had a big role in huge moments in United States history. And that's the 1992 LA civil unrest. That's what I'm referring to right now. Of course, we're also thinking about current things, current issues, current topics, but really I'm pinpointing that. And we'll get into that in a minute, but let's continue. So we know now why it's needed, why it's important. Now let's talk about why Korean Americans are not informed, or Korean Americans who are not informed about US and Asian history. We talked about the larger Asian American population. When you break it down to Koreans, and you can see here on this chart to the right, it's broken down by pretty much Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Korean, Vietnamese, and Japanese. 25% of the Korean American population are not informed about US Asian history. 24% of Korean Americans say they are informed about US Asian history, and the rest fall somewhere in between. Clearly, there is a need to teach Korean American history as part of the larger scope of Asian American history. You can't just teach specifically Chinese American history and then leave it at that, right? You have to teach about each one, because remember, Asian American is this umbrella term, right? That was created in the 1960s, right, during the civil rights movement by a couple of scholars from UC Berkeley. It is an umbrella term that both serves us, but also harms us. This is the two sides of that term. And it harms us because if we're under this umbrella category, then we're only looking at one face. We're not looking at the multiple faces, right? So we're not looking at Korean, we're not looking at Japanese, we're not looking at Chinese, we're not looking at Filipino, we're not looking at Hmong, we're not looking at Cambodian. We're only looking at Asian American. And that's why, again, it's very important that we teach Korean American history as well, as its own standalone, perhaps, unit in a larger Asian American studies course. This is what I do when I'm teaching at the different colleges. I also teach ethnic studies at different universities throughout Southern California. So when I'm teaching that, I don't just want to teach Asian American history as a whole, but I'm teaching who they were, each community, right? So that's why it's so important. And where do Korean Americans live in the United States? And this is from 2019 census data. These are the top 10 US metropolitan areas by Korean population. Of course, Los Angeles, Koreatown, right? Los Angeles, that area. This is the heart of Korean America, as I like to call it, right? New York comes in second place, 220,000 Koreans. Washington, Seattle, Chicago, San Francisco, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Dallas, and San Jose, California. Now, if you look at this data, you understand then that the majority of the Korean American population resides in these metropolitan cities, which tend to be interethnic. And this is something to keep in mind before we move on to the 1992 LA civil unrest and the political awakening of Korean Americans in this quick lecture here, but I want you to keep that in mind because this is an important thing. If this small population is residing in these large metropolitan cities and they are attached to this model minority myth and yellow peril myth, some things may happen later. And that's exactly what we see during the 1992 LA civil unrest. But let's move on. So I wanted to give you guys some resources. And if you haven't downloaded the PowerPoint slide, I believe it's still available. Is that right? President Kim, it's still available for folks to download? I think so, right? I'm going to assume yes.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, perfect. So these next several slides are just slides on resources that you can use to teach Korean American history. And many of you will have been like, oh yes, we know Koreans in America by Bong Yoon Choi, right? The Korean Frontiers in America, which is misspelled, my apologies. Immigration to Hawaii by Wayne Patterson. These are seminal texts, right? There's others though, To Save the Children of Korea, The Cold War Origins of International Adoption by Arissa Oh, and the Koreans in Hawaii, A Pictorial History 1903 to 2003 by Roberta Chang with Wayne Patterson. We also have, of course, the textbook that I co-authored with Dr. Chang, Korean Americans, A Concise History, Koreatown, Los Angeles, Immigration, Race, and the American Dream by Shelley Sang-Hui Lee. This is more of a newer book, right? So we have that there. Korean Relations with Blacks and Latinos After Civil Unrest by Dr. Kae-young Park at UCLA. Pachapa Camp, The First Koreatown by Dr. Edward T. Chang. Korean American Pioneer Aviators, The Willows Airmen by Dr. Edward T. Chang and Woo Sung Han. And I've got, there we go, online resources for you. So this is probably going to be more useful to you than the textbooks, unless you want to torture your poor students with textbooks. I find that these are great. Of course, the first one is going to be that short film documentary that I helped to write and produce, Footsteps of Korean Americans. That is free and available online. National Association of Korean Americans has a great website on history of Korean Americans. KoreanAmericanStory.org is a great website for stories of Korean Americans who are from the older generation, from my generation, and from youth generation, mostly from the older generation and my generation. But it is a great website to help contextualize, right, these stories and the history that we're teaching into everyday lived experiences, right? Because that's the other thing I would say. When we are teaching Korean American history and Korean American immigration history, one of the things that we're going to do is lose our students, right, in this whole ocean of data, right, and historical facts. And one of the things that I found really helps is to contextualize all of this information into their everyday lived experiences. And the way I do that is by coupling all of this data, all of this historical information with stuff like this from the KoreanAmericanStory.org video series, with videos like the history video, The Footsteps of Korean Americans, and also sites like the Political Awakening of Korean Americans site and video, which gives firsthand, right, testimony and firsthand experience about what the elders experienced during the 1992 LA civil unrest. There's also the PBS NewsHour video with Dr. Chang and the first Pachapa Camp, the first Koreatown in the United States. And then there are Korean American lesson plans written and provided by teachers and scholars and community activists, etc. And this is going to be available to you for free, downloadable from the UCR website at yokcenter.ucr.edu. And how fortuitous for you that I happen to be the person who manages this website and will be uploading all of these things. And if you want to contribute to this database or archive of lesson plans, the YOK Center is accepting those. And I believe they're going to pay a small stipend for your work. So if you would like to do that, do feel free to reach out to me, and I'll put my email into the chat with so that you can reach out to me if you want to provide extra lesson plans. But these are, again, some resources that you can use. Great books here, great books here. This stuff I think is going to be your best bet, right? So again, download this from the Google Drive and you should be good to go. Otherwise, I would click on all of these and share them with you, but we won't waste our time. Okay, so one of the things we're going to think about then is, what are we teaching when it comes to Korean American immigration in history? Oftentimes I'll follow a pattern. Sometimes I teach the Korean American studies class at UCR. And so I follow a very specific thing, but you don't have to, right? You can focus on a very specific part, like early Korean American history or modern Korean American, right, stuff. So, but this is what I usually teach. I teach general history of Korea, Japanese colonization, the early 20th century, culture, identity, and community, the independence movement. And I mean independence movement both in Korea, but also with the diasporic communities. So we're talking about what the Korean American community did for the independence movement of, right, their homeland. That's often missed in scholarship. And so that's why I talk about it, because again, we're talking about Korean American history and Korean American identity, which is, I want to make the distinctive point here, a separate thing from Korean identity in South Korea, right? So for example, myself, I'm born here, raised here. If I go to South Korea, what's going to happen to me? How many of you are either 1.5 or second generation? And you go back to South Korea, what happens to you? Anyone want to volunteer that thought?
We feel foreign.
Yes, exactly. We feel foreign, right? Totally foreign. I went there a couple of times and I got these looks like, oh, 한국 분이요, right? Are you Korean? Yes, sir, I am, right? Yes, 어디서 태어났어? I'm like, oh, well, I was born in the United States. So it's really, really important to teach Korean American history, because it will contextualize the experiences of your students today. Most of your students are likely going to be second generation or 1.5 generation, and they're going to need to understand the difference between Korean American identity and then Korean identity from homeland. Super, super important, because our experiences are vastly different, right? My experience growing up as the daughter of a gas station owner, right, working these crazy long hours and shifts, vastly different perhaps than a South Korean, right, daughter who may have been growing up in a different way, perhaps working, yes, but maybe didn't experience as much inter-ethnic conflict, right? These are the things that we need to discuss. And that's why it's so important to make that distinctive note when talking about culture, identity, and community when you're teaching Korean American history and immigration. The other thing we should talk about is official immigration, right? And how Koreans came to the United States. Official immigration is noted as January 13th, 1903. And we have to remember that there were Koreans here prior to that, but this is when official immigration is noted in US history books. We need to talk about the push-pull factors of why Koreans were coming to the United States and why there was diaspora of the Korean population, right? And of course, we know that's because of Japanese colonization of the peninsula, pushing Koreans outside of their homeland. And this is why they came to the United States, also seeking better lives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then one of the things I've added most recently was this discussion about the first organized Koreatown, or the first organized Korean American settlement, which was actually in Riverside, California. It's mind-boggling to think about, but that is actually the case. Tucson and Changho came to Riverside sometime in 1904 and established the first Koreatown. It was noted in the Shinhan Minbo. It was noted in other people's written texts that there was a Koreatown here organized. And this is an important part to teach about Korean American history, because it sets what? A foundation for Korean American history, community, and identity. And I won't get into too many details about that, but there are several articles. There is a book by Dr. Chang who made that discovery called Pachapa Camp, right? And if you take a look at that, it's a great way to see how early Korean Americans lived in the United States, what they did, where did they work, how did they work together with each other, what did they do for the Korean independence movement, right? Here in the United States, they donated to the Korean National Association funds, they held meetings, they held rallies, they did so many things that are often, again, left out in the larger discussion of Korean independence movement activities. And so other things to teach are also Korean American, again, involvement in the independence movement. Some examples there. Here's one that folks may not often think about or know about the Willows Korean Aviation School and Course. If you're going to teach Korean American history, I would say pull this little nugget out and kind of expand upon it, because the South Korean government looks at the Willows Korean Aviation School and Course in Willows, California, as its origin. What? Right? When I learned that fact, I was deeply moved and amazed. And that's because it connects Korean Americans to the homeland in a very significant way, right? And there's a whole book about the Willows Korean Aviation School and Course written by Dr. Edward T. Chang and Mr. Woo Sung Han, and it discusses its origins, who they were, who were these students, why were they doing this, what were their lives like, and the first two aviation officers who graduated from this school, becoming the first aviation officers of the Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai, right, prior to the establishment of the actual Korean government many years later after liberation. So other things to teach too would be World War II and Colonel Young-Ok Kim, the namesake of the center that I work at and am a graduate student researcher at. Colonel Young-Ok Kim is another nugget you might want to pull out, right, for World War II and the Korean War, because he served in both wars. And he was a Los Angeles born Korean American, a war hero. He is someone that could be seen as a model even for a Korean American to look up to, right? Korean Americans, we don't often have folks that we can point to as Korean Americans to say, oh, this person was so significant in history. And well, I say we can look at him as a model. I mean this from both him being a war hero, but also from him being a community activist and a humanitarian. Now, when you type up his name and you look him up, you'll find all these wonderful stories about him being this just amazing officer in the US Army during World War II and the amazing feats he accomplished as a war hero. But in actuality, when he retired from the Army, he went to Los Angeles and established 5 of the most major nonprofit organizations and worked to help the underserved communities of that area, because he had promised himself in World War II, if I survive this war, I will help people. I will dedicate my life to helping others. So he did do that. So he's a great story to pull out and talk about in a lesson plan. If you're going to do like a project, he might be a great subject to take out as a project to research and present on, because he has such an amazing background, and his humanitarian work alone could fill up books and books and books and books, right? But again, Colonel Young-Ok Kim, someone I'm calling out because just amazing his work. And then the other things we can talk about too, for what to teach are the Korean War, adoptees, war brides, and the role of Korean American women in immigration. Now I'm going to pause here for a second. Korean American women and their role. This is a super important thing, because oftentimes Korean American women and women in general, right, we're left out, right? We're left out. The history books don't often call us out. And when we're talking about Korean American history and immigration, Korean women often left out. You don't often hear their stories, right? We all know about Tosan Chang-ho, but what about Helen On, his wife, right? What about some amazing women like Ellen Thun? These are names you probably have never heard. What about Violet Catherine Kim? All these stories, by the way, you can find in the Korean Americans, A Concise History short book, textbook. But I call this out because this is a moment when you can, again, create a project, perhaps create a mini unit within the unit, right? The larger unit of Korean American history and immigration history and all this stuff, and talk about the role of women, because women, Korean American women, were pivotal in bringing Koreans to the United States after the Korean War and post 1965 Immigration Act. That is a huge thing that happened. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, or the Hart-Celler Act, was super important in increasing the Korean American population and really Asian American population overall. Because after that act, it opened up the borders. It opened up immigration to the United States. So what did the Korean American women do? Under the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, they were allowed to bring family members, right? Of course, this act also allowed for you to come if you had skills that the United States was looking for. But the Korean American women played a huge role in sponsoring mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, right? Children, if they had children before, right? You name it, cousins. This is how my mom came to the United States. Her cousin sponsored her to come here, and that's why I was born here, right? So super important thing to note, Korean American women, their role in how they helped to increase the Korean American population, increase through immigration by sponsoring them post-1965 Immigration Act. There's that 1965 Immigration Act that I was talking about. And then other things you could teach are Korean American community characteristics, which include that we are very church centric. If you look at different immigrant communities, there are no other immigrant communities that are so tied to church the way that the Korean American community is. It has been so since the early 1900s. When Pachapa Camp was founded, the Calvary Presbyterian Church, local church, was linked to them. They even had a mission at the community site, a mission. And so what do Koreans do at church other than go to as a place of worship? They would talk about independence movement activities, have economic exchanges, right? Or what we call F-class resources. They would rely upon each other, say, hey, I want to open a business. Can we somehow pool our resources, right? This would happen even in the post-1965 Immigration Act communities as well. They would arrange marriages, right? They would socialize. They would do all kinds of things. So church was a centric place for them. And this is a big Korean American community characteristic. I think Dr. David Yu at UCLA has a book on this. So if you're interested, look him up. He has a great book on Korean religion and all that stuff. And it's a great book. But anyways, really important to talk about Korean community characteristics. And then again, to contextualize them into our everyday lived experiences. The next thing too that I would cover would be second and third generation Korean Americans, the shifting population from foreign born to American born, and also that generational gap, right? So the older Korean population versus the youth, or my second generation or 1.5 generation, there is a gap, right? There's a communication gap. I don't know about how many of you, but I mean, whether you're Korean or not, your relationship with your parents or some of your elders, right, can be a little strained or different. Our communication isn't quite there, right? I know with my mom, it took about 5 years of me interviewing her for the book for her to finally open up about things that happened 25 years before, right? So it's an important thing to discuss the generation gap and how to bridge that, right? So that's something, again, that you could teach as part of a Korean American history unit within the larger course. One of the other things to talk about is, as Dr. Kim noted so heavily and rightfully so, anti-Asian hate, the rise of anti-Asian hate. And this is a good way to get your students to be engaged. When I start talking about anti-Asian hate in my classes and contextualizing it into the COVID-19 pandemic and asking the students, how many of you have experienced anti-Asian hate or witnessed anti-Asian hate if you are not Asian? I would say about 60–70% will raise their hands. And if I have a class of 100 students, that's a lot of students. So it's really important to talk about that, its origins, its evolution, and to what we are experiencing today and why we are experiencing that. And so that would, again, include talking about the model minority myth and the yellow peril ideology. And then the next thing would be the 1970s to the 1990s, the post-1965 immigration community, 1965 Act immigration community, and the inter-ethnic conflict and the 1992 LA civil unrest. And that's going to bring us into this part of the seminar or the lecture, the post-Los Angeles Uprising and political awakening section. Now, before I get into this, let me stop here for a moment because I tend to blather on. Are there any questions, any thoughts, any comments, anything that you want to talk about before we move on to the next section about teaching Korean American history and immigration? Let me open it up to you all. I'm going to look in the chat here. Oh, I see someone put beef in there. That was great. Kyle says, while teaching English and EFL in Seoul, I often incorporate Korean and Asian American content in order to help introduce Korean students to begin to consider variations and similarities in their history, culture, identity, and prospective migrations to the West. Yes, that's awesome. I love it. We have adult DALI FLC, Osan, Korea. I never taught about the history of Korean American immigrants, but might consider the topic to teach, but I have to distinguish South Korean versus Korean American from the US. Yes, I would say that's super, super important as well, because yes, the two identities are so different. But again, I'll open it up to you guys. Any thoughts here, comments, questions?
Hi, my name is just, go ahead.
You go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Josephine Pekovsky. It's like 1:33 in the morning here in Korea, so I might start a little bit. But I'd like to add to Carol Park's comment about teaching the topic about Korean American immigration. I never taught before. I teach for the Defense Language Institute, so all my students are adults. And also, I never thought about the importance of Korean American immigrants, the role they play in the American society. But as a 1.5 Korean American generation, I went to America when I was in my late, it was 18 or 19 years old. So I see the difference after having been away from Korea for so many years and coming back here in Korea to teach. Although I teach on base, US Air Force Base here in Korea, I can see the difference in the mindset of Korean living here in Korea. And for someone like me, who was actually born here in Korea and yet had lived in America for so many years. So I still have a difficult time sometimes, understanding the way of thinking, particularly the Koreans after the foreign currency crisis, MZ generations. So it is a adjusting time, even for me, after having been here almost 5 years. So a culture shock, yes, there is. Even for someone like me who was born and raised here and spent 18 years of my life. And then it is not quite the way that I thought how the Koreans were when I left Korea. So you're truly right, Carol Park. You have to distinguish South Korean versus Korean American in the US. I cannot say, you cannot just teach Korean American, including South Koreans, treating them the same way with their history and the variations, for that matter, in terms of teaching Korean American immigration topic. Thank you. I really enjoy this topic.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. And yes, exactly. Perfect example, right? She's giving us that firsthand experience, right? That's why it's so important. Thank you so much. And then Dr. Kim, go ahead.
Carol, I was wondering if you could share some of your advice on the oral history that you're able to capture from your mother. I would think that that's a powerful, activity for teachers to have students ask questions to their parents, but sometimes like that could be hard for parents or for the child for various reasons. Do you have any advice or suggestions on, if you didn't have a lot of time, like 5 years, but you had like a shorter time, what advice you would give to teachers on how to interview their own parents?
Oh, yes. Well, so I do assign this activity as an extra credit assignment to my Asian American Studies classes and Korean American Studies classes. And I'll say this, if you're going to assign it as a 4-credit assignment for the grade, give them an outline or a structure and some questions to ask them and tell them, you might not get anything from your parents, but encourage them to continue the exercise beyond the classroom, because this will definitely help improve that generation gap that we were talking about. But as in terms of advice, I would say have them really sit down with their parents, go over the questions that you've given them, but have them also come up with their own set of questions as well. And then they can have those too. And then to record it either via video or audio, or if their parents are not comfortable, then to take the notes. When it came to my own mother, that was a really difficult challenge. It took several years for her to finally open up to me. And so the biggest thing I took away from that was just persistence. So if you're going to assign it in the classroom, it's a great starting point, but it might take your students many, many, many moons to actually break ground with their parents. But that was a great question. And also, now that you mention it, another resource for Korean American history and teaching history and identity is this oral histories project that I actually put together. It's a project of 50 Korean American oral histories that Dr. Chang and I went and recorded throughout the country, and it's available online. And there's videos and transcripts. Right now, it's the website is a little bit wonky because I'm revising it, but I'll go ahead and share that link with President Kim, and perhaps we can put that in the Google Drive as well. But there's plenty of resources for oral histories, and then that advice again being persistent and have your students go beyond the classroom. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Kim. And then I see in the chat, you mentioned the yellow peril ideology and one other challenge or characteristic in anti-Asian hate. Can you review that again, please? Yes, so yellow peril and model minority myth. These are two things that go hand in hand. And I'm calling it, I coined the term in an article that's coming out in the fall in an Asian American Studies journal. And I'll say it here, and I said it at the Korean American Studies conference earlier this year. I'm calling it the perilously model characteristic of Asian Americans. And again, that article will come out in the fall. So if you want to cite it, you can. But I'm saying it here because those two things go hand in hand. We are both at the same time feared and loved. If we are feared, we're hated because disease, because economic threat, yellow peril, right? Foreign, xenophobia, right? It's really xenophobia. And then we're loved because, oh my gosh, look at how well we've assimilated into society. Look at how well we're doing. And this is the furthest thing from the truth, right? It's just another way to pit ethnic communities against each other. Why can't you be more like the Koreans? Why can't you be more like the Chinese or the Japanese or the Asian Indians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? These are the two things that Asian Americans are consistently and constantly being categorized as and stereotyped as. And I'm building off of scholar Claire Jean Kem's work, her racial triangulation theory, and just really combining the two terms. And Yuko Kawai's article on yellow peril and the dialectic of the model minority. So those are two things you can look up if you want to expand your understanding of these two ideologies. Yuko Kawai's article is really, really good. I would highly recommend her article as well. I'll even type her name into the chat so you can look that up. Yuko Kawai, there you go. But yes, so those were the two things. Before we move on, any other thoughts or questions or comments? I think we're running out of time. Oh no, 10 more minutes. If not, I'll move on. All right, so let's go to post-Los Angeles uprising and political awakening, the Korean Americans during the 1992 LA civil unrest. Now, full disclosure, my mom had a business in California when the riots erupted, or when the civil unrest erupted. I was a small child at that time. I was working there prior to the LA civil unrest, during the LA civil unrest, and after the LA civil unrest. We did not sell that business until it was 2014. So what you're about to hear is from firsthand experience as well as research experience as well. So before the LA civil unrest, we already know if you're teaching Korean American history, immigration, community, and identity, we know in a nutshell that Korean Americans were a little more secluded. We existed in our ethnic enclaves. We didn't quite communicate. We didn't quite interact as much. We were really concerned about homeland politics. We really were. At first, it was about the liberation of Korea from Japanese occupation, and then it became about the reunification of North and South Korea, right? So before that, we're kind of like this. We're a little insular. That doesn't mean we didn't have, though, communication. We did, we tried in small pockets here and there, but largely we were seen as this very small community. There were about 800,000 of us by the time it was 1990, not a very large population. So when the 1992 LA civil unrest occurred, people were like, Koreans who, right? Korean what? Korean War? So before the LA civil unrest, that's kind of where we were. When the LA civil unrest erupted, there was a heavy involvement of the media, and they termed what we call the interethnic conflict the Black Korean conflict. Now, growing up, I saw it everywhere in the newspapers. If you're reading the Korean newspapers and watching the American news, you would always see, oh, you know, Korean shop owner shoots and kills, blah, blah, blah. And the most prominent one being the murder of Latasha Harlins, the 15-year-old young girl by Korean shop owner Sun Ja-do. So you would see these types of headlines splashed across newspapers, splashing across TV, right? News stories, you name it. This is what the perception was, right? When the 1992 LA civil unrest erupted. Now, we may not have time to go into all the details, but we know that the LA civil unrest erupted because of the 4 not guilty verdicts in the Rodney King beating case, police brutality. That's a whole other subject that we do not have time to cover, right? Police brutality, the ongoing subjugation and anti-Blackness, right? That's occurring in this country, right? Still occurring. But when the LA civil unrest happened, it was because of that. But a sub-occurrence was this interethnic conflict. It was not the reason that the LA civil unrest occurred, which is what the media tried to portray to us. It just happened to be the sub thing that was happening on top of the larger social issues of anti-Blackness and police brutality, right? That was the main reason for the eruption of the LA civil unrest. But while that was happening, the Black Korean conflict would come to the forefront of the media. Oh, look at this. Look at how Koreans are suffering, their American dreams going up in flames, this model minority. Oh, there's that term again, right? This model minority who came here seeking the place where ketchup and Spam overflow, right? Seeking this place where opportunity, right, abounds. Look at all this happening because of this community's hate for them. When in reality, there was something else going on. Why was this interethnic conflict even occurring in the first place? Well, because of that model minority myth. We're not a model. Why were we even having businesses there in the first place in inner city communities? Why? Because my mom and dad could not work in corporate America, right? My mom and dad actually didn't graduate from college. My mom barely had high school education, right? And they were trying their best, but the only thing they could do was open businesses. I don't know. The American dream to me sounds a little problematic, but again, another topic we can discuss later. But going back to the Black Korean conflict, this was what was brought to the forefront of the media's coverage. How many of you saw that footage, right, of the Korean man shooting, right? This is a very famous image. This is what we saw. And this is all that was seen. Korean Americans had no voice. They had no politicians going to bat for them, right? Who was going to speak for this 800,000 small slice of the American pie? This was a wake-up call, a watershed moment for the Korean American community who had to fend for themselves, abandoned by Los Angeles police, abandoned, right? That's where we get the term rooftop Korean. How many of you have heard of that, right? There's a resurgence of this term, right? Rooftop Korean. This is where it comes from the 1992 LA civil unrest, when ajashi and ajima, well, mostly ajashis, right, were on the rooftops of their businesses trying to defend, right, what they had worked so hard for. But this was all, again, that we would see. No one was talking about why this was happening. No one was representing the Korean American community. So this moment in history in 1992 becomes the birth or rebirth, according to some, of the Korean American identity. This was the political awakening as well as the social awakening of our community. Korean Americans would get involved in politics. We would raise our voices. There would be coalition building, giving back to communities. Other organizations would be established. The Council of Korean Americans was established much later, but organizations like that. And what do we mean by getting involved in politics and raising their voices? Well, Korean Americans didn't sit by the sidelines anymore. They actually organized during the LA civil unrest. May 1st, they went out and protested, asked for peace. It was one of the largest gatherings of Asian Americans and Korean Americans really ever in the history of this country, right? This is what they started to do. It was a moment of action, a moment of saying enough, right? This is anti-Asian hate, right? Anti-Korean hate, but anti-Asian hate overall, right? It was a moment when Korean Americans said, we will not be insular. We will communicate. And so what did they do? The business people, the Korean American community leaders started talking to other organizations, to other ethnic community leaders and said, well, what can we do? So they started to give back. Okay, let's donate to this community center, right? Let's work with one another. Let's tell our stories. A social awakening. The younger generation, as we grew up and saw our parents, we decided to do what? Record their histories, those oral histories coming into play, right? We decided to write about their experiences. We decided to go into politics. And that means we had stuff like this. Who were those Korean American politicians who started to get involved post 1992? This is the generation that grew up, my generation that grew up, right? We grew up to have that voice because we speak English well, right? Because we understand the American political landscape and how to navigate it. So we have Andy Kim, we have Representative Marilyn Strickland, we have Young Kim, we have Michelle Park Steele. David Ryu became the first Korean American to sit on LA City Council when he was elected in 2015. We have Mary Chung Hayashi, California Assembly member of the 18th Assembly District, 2006 to 2012. She became the first Korean American woman to serve in the state legislature. And we had, of course, Alfred Song, our pioneering Korean American politician, who was our only lone voice, right, a politician in California, Korean American politician in California at the time of the LA civil unrest, right? So we had nothing, basically nothing. But since the LA civil unrest, we have had a surge. Now Korean Americans are visible. Now we are in politics. And if you're going to wonder, where do Korean American political affiliations lie? Well, 67% are registered as Democrats, 28% are registered as Republicans. And this is kind of a shift from the older generation. The older generation used to be more Republican. Now we've shifted towards more to Democrats. So this is kind of where our political characteristics are today. What are some of our current issues and topics? Well, we're still thinking about our participation in politics, fighting against anti-Asian hate and stereotypes, and the model minority myth. And of course, the LGBTQ plus, right, topics, right? Korean American community needs to address this, needs to look at this and accept this, right? And we'll also have our K-drama, our K-pop, the Hallyu wave as it's known, and the visibility of our community. We are more visible in mainstream American media. I mean, someone just posted it in the chat, beef, right? How many of you saw that? I think this was a very nice depiction of both the upper echelons of the Asian community, which is the model minority thing, and then how we're actually not model minority with Stephen Yun's character, right? Where we are living in poverty, right? If you disaggregate the data, Asian Americans, there's a large population that lives in poverty, right? So it's a great little show, but we are part of mainstream American media is the point here. That there is a Netflix show, right? Highlighting a Korean American story within this larger story is amazing. I never thought I'd see the day, but here we are. From K-pop to K-dramas on Netflix, Korean barbecue, right? Etc. We have voice, but we have so much further to go in breaking stereotypes and assumptions about our small community. And someone's asking in the chat, can you elaborate on the model minority myth? Sure. So model minority basically says that Asian Americans are assimilating well into American society, basically becoming closer to becoming white, right? This is basically it, that we're quiet, that we don't protest, that we're wealthy, that we're highly educated, right? All the positive things. And that this model minority, right, is what other ethnic communities should be aspiring to. This is that model minority myth in a nutshell. But hopefully that helps, Amir. Awesome. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to ask you, because I think we're just about out of time here. Oh, I'm a little bit over time, is well, sorry, the road ahead. We need to also think about mixed ethnic identity, something I don't want to forget to mention, right? There's a very big thing we need to address and talk about as we move forward and our population growth. But before we end here, I wanted to open this up to you because I'm dying to know what you all would like to teach. What should we focus on? What are your thoughts and ideas? And I'm going to open it up to Q&A and also say thank you so much for your time. That was very compacted and full of information, and I hope it helps you.